I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You dare once in your life.
Hey, people. Trish Wood here, and this is the Trish Wood is Critical podcast. Let me start by saying if I sound a little bit different today, it's because I'm on what a podcaster would call a remote kit. I'm in Ottawa using a different microphone, covering the trial of Tamara Lich and Chris Barber for their participation in the Freedom Convoy. And it's been a hell of a week. Part of me can't even believe it's happening. It seems so strange to see these people sitting in a courtroom charged with criminal offenses, especially given the TikToks that we were viewing yesterday, which showed, I guess they showed something for the Crown, but they also showed what a decent guy Chris Barber certainly appears to be. I know him a bit, and that's how I see him. And so the idea that good people are on trial for civil disobedience and protesting a legitimate issue in a courtroom in Ottawa is a very kind of strange experience, causing some cognitive dissonance in my head. I kind of look around and think, is this really happening every day while I'm in there? So that's why I sound different. It's been hot as heck in Ottawa as well. So you kind of show up in court feeling like a dirty dog, very, very tired and very sweaty. It's very kind of Southern Gothic. But we are allowed to have water bottles in the courtroom. So it's been a very, very interesting time for me. It's been a long time since I've covered what we used to call cops and courts, and I'm getting the hang of it again. But one thing I sort of didn't remember and probably should have is how absolutely exhausting it is. Because what happens when you're covering a trial, you have to be on your toes, listening to the evidence all day long. And I've been live tweeting a little. And then in my case, going back to my hotel room and writing a Substack that covers everything that happened. So the workday is about 12 hours long. It's a long, hard day. And when it's a subject you care very much about, as I do, it makes it even more difficult. So that's what I'm doing. But I'm going back home. I'm recording this on Friday, and I'm going back home tonight for the weekend, and we'll be back here at some point next week to do some more follow-up reporting. And the legacy media, I will say, they have not been doing a terrible job. They've been pretty much sticking to the facts. It's interesting to compare what I've been doing to what they've been doing, because they do pick different facts to highlight in their stories, but they are facts. They are true facts. So they haven't been terrible yet, at least in the covering of the convoy trial. So today's going to be a very special episode for me. You're going to be meeting my friend Jacqueline Bynon, who is a highly critically acclaimed true crime television producer. She's worked for all the big networks and most of the streamers. And she is working on the film that I've been crowdfunding, which is The Trials of Tamara Lich. We're focusing on telling the story of the convoy and what the taking apart of the convoy means for protest, not just here in Canada, but in the world as well. So that's the focus of the film we're doing. We've already done some shooting. It's turned out really well, and we're quite proud of it. So she's going to be here. And then also we have Tom Marazzo, who has a new book out about his experience with the Freedom Convoy, and he's going to be joining us soon as well. But before we get there, I got a bee in my bonnet about our Prime Minister suggesting about a week or 10 days ago, I guess, that Canadians weren't forced to take the COVID-19 vaccine. What a load of garbage. Talk about gaslighting. Sometimes he says things that just make my head absolutely spin, as you know. So I put out a call to y'all to go to my website and include on our audio recording platform your comments about not being coerced into taking the vaccine. And we're going to play those now. But I want to start by playing one of our audio supercuts. It starts with the Prime Minister, and then you'll hear different voices of different leaders, Australia, New Zealand, and also 2 Pfizer executives saying that nobody was forced or coerced into taking the vaccine. So let's listen to that. And then we will come back and play some of your comments about not being forced to take the vaccine. Here we go.
Individuals are allowed to make their own choices. There may be all sorts of different reasons why someone is hesitant to get vaccinated. And therefore, while not forcing anyone to get vaccinated, enforcement measures in place will make sure that everyone is vaccinated.
People to have their jobs, to keep their jobs, were forced to have the vaccination. Now, do you retract your statement that they were not forced?
Senator, no, I believe firmly that nobody was forced to have a vaccine.
There's people that don't want this mandatory vaccine. How do we manage this?
Well, then they won't be going to work.
Okay.
It's very, very simple.
I believe everybody was offered an opportunity to get a vaccine or not get a vaccine. I don't believe that anybody was forced to take a vaccine.
We have said no, you must get vaccinated.
In terms of the vaccine mandates, I acknowledge that it was a challenging time for people, but they ultimately made their own choices.
A vaccine mandate is being expanded to around 40% of all workers.
You basically see it as two different classes of people. If you're vaccinated or if you're unvaccinated, you have all these rights. If you are vaccinated...
That is what it is, so, yep.
Hospitality, hairdressers and gyms can operate at all levels if they ask customers for a vaccine certificate.
There was no compulsory vaccination. People made their own choices.
And so it follows that if customers must be vaccinated, then so too must the workers.
Yeah, so if you thought even for a second that any of these leaders who were forcing through mandates vaccines on their citizens would ever apologize or say we got it wrong or I wish we hadn't done that or I'm learning from my mistakes, forget it. They're just gaslighting each and every one of them. It's absolutely shocking and very, very disheartening too. We have now some clips of people really from around the world talking about how the vaccine mandates and the forcing of vaccines on people affected their lives. And our first one comes from Carolyn Johnson in Ontario, Canada.
Hi, Trish. My name is Carolyn, and I'm a teacher in Toronto. The government didn't force us to take the jab? No, of course not. They didn't pin us down and stick us with needles. No, they just passed the buck to employers and said, everyone has to come up with their own vaccination policy. It just so happened that my employer, Toronto French School, said, no jab, no job. My choice was to take a minimal severance package and say goodbye to my tenured position or take an unpaid leave of absence until March when I'd be forced to resign or capitulate anyway if they hadn't changed their policy. So it's true, I had a choice. What is also true is that it was not a choice I wanted to make. I had to make the best bad choice between job or jab. In the end, I reasoned there are other jobs, but I only have one body. I took the package. No one forced me to take the jab. True enough, but let's never forget, we were not allowed to keep jobs we loved, eat indoors at restaurants, go to the cinema, sporting events, museums. We weren't allowed to travel on planes or trains or visit the U.S. The coercion tactics were real, and I know many people who succumbed. They were truly forced to take the experimental mRNA injections. And the physical and psychological toll on all of us, on those who took the jab against our will and on those who were dismissed from jobs because we didn't toe the line, has been immense. And so I'm proud to wear your We the Fringe toque. I thank you, Trish. Keep up the amazing work.
So that was Carolyn Johnson. Next up is Greg Brown from New Zealand.
Hi, Trish. Greg here from New Zealand. This is pretty interesting in itself, but our Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, who replaced the odious Jacinda Ardern earlier this year, has also come out in the last week with a statement eerily similar to Justin Trudeau. I quote, "In terms of the vaccine mandates, I acknowledge that it was a challenging time for people, but they ultimately made their own choices. There was no compulsory vaccination. People made their own choices." Well, Chris, Justin, I lost my job twice due to these non-compulsory mandatory vaccinations. First, I had to leave my job as a primary care doctor, a GP, over Christmas 2021. Less than 2 months later, I was also served notice of termination from the New Zealand military, for whom I was also working at the time. My 15-year-old son couldn't continue his cafe job without being double jabbed, Our entire family was barred from restaurants, cafes, public buildings like libraries, and many more. The church I helped to lead was restricted to a shifting landscape of different gathering sizes. But hey, if we implemented the vaccine pass system on a Sunday morning, we could meet again as one happy vaccinated family. No way were we going to do that, and we didn't. So yes, esteemed Prime Ministers, we did indeed make our own choices. I chose not to believe your military-grade information warfare propaganda. I chose to lead my family through this surreal period of apartheid without bowing the knee to your tyranny. I chose to stand firm. And Trish, I know you get this a lot, but you were a lifeline through all this. You and your guests helped me to have the courage to continue. Thank you so much for helping me feel less alone. God bless you.
I always get a little verklempt when people say things like that. He nailed it, right? I mean, he said exactly what so many of us have been feeling. And New Zealand and Australia were two places that mimicked Canada as one of the most tyrannical countries in the world with respect to COVID policy. Long lockdowns, heavy-duty mandates, and in some cases, a police presence to enforce what is and was bad public health policy. So he says we're not alone. We're not alone. People in other countries have experienced exactly what we as Canadians have felt. Let's end this trio. I'm going to play more next week, but let's end this trio of voices with a woman who identified only as Jennifer, also Canadian, but she is very emotional about how this played out in her life. And I'll tell you, it must have been a bit of a double whammy for her psyche, not just that this happened to her, but then that our Prime Minister denied that it happened. Here's Jennifer.
Hi, Trish. Thank you for the opportunity for those of us who were not coerced into taking vaccines to tell our stories. I am an Ontario resident and formerly proud Canadian. For 16 years, I worked in a senior position for a major global retailer whose Canadian headquarters are based in Toronto. Having studied business and fashion as a young, bright-eyed student, I was blessed to work in my dream job for many years. I honestly thought I would never leave, until I was forced to. After first assuring employees the company would not be mandating vaccines, to then not only mandating it, but threatening immediate termination if not in compliance, I was in absolute shock that the company I had given years of my life to would so quickly act as though my value was meaningless. Not only did they refuse to grant my exemption request based on human rights protected grounds, they terminated me on a without cause basis and failed to offer an even remotely fair severance package, commensurate with the many years of my experience, high compensation levels, and the personal damages that they caused to my mental health, my dignity, and to my family. This well-respected company, who championed diversity and inclusion on a daily basis, turned out to be the furthest thing from inclusive. A giant part of my life that I no longer recognized. Sort of like the country that I used to love. No one should ever have to choose between bodily autonomy and their livelihood. Ever. My heart goes out to everyone else who has suffered a similar fate over the last 3 years. And to the Prime Minister, who emboldened companies like mine to enact such draconian measures. We will not be gaslit into believing none of this ever happened. It did happen, and we will never forget.
I was going to throw to our weekly funding pitch, but I think I won't, because I want to hear from both Jackie and Tom about those comments. Jackie, what she said there kind of reflected many of the conversations we were having every day throughout COVID. The sense that we felt we were kind of losing touch with our fellow Canadians, that this was not the country that we thought it was, especially through the way that they were implementing these mandates on people and crushing people with them.
Yeah, you're right, Trish. In fact, our conversations were, I would venture to say, were therapy sessions.
Yeah.
Because you were hearing so much discontent. And we with COVID, COVID, I believe, we're in an age of discontent. And COVID, that was already there. And then when COVID came, it accelerated that discontent. But we felt helpless, because if you can't choose between not taking a vaccine or being able to have a livelihood, that's a tall order. That's a tall order to take. I know I had to travel all over the U.S. to do what I was doing. So I had a choice: get the jab or don't do it. And when you're contractual and you're doing this kind of stuff, I did it. But I eventually came to the decision that never again, I will never comply to that. But listening to those people, and as that woman said, and as the guy from New Zealand said, listening to your shows like yours gave people that sort of, there was somebody else out there, because that's what people felt. Trapped in their homes, not being able to make a living, having to make decisions they never imagined for a second they would have to, really frightened people. And I think what's happened since has the government and bureaucrats and the gang who realized, wow, that really worked. Now what else can we do?
Yeah.
So that's why when I hear people like that, they were looking for somebody to say you're not alone. Yeah. And eventually I think that's exactly what the trucker Freedom Convoy became.
Well, it's interesting that Trudeau made that comment that provoked this kind of historical review right at the time that the truckers are on trial, facing some criminal charges. I think part of the problem for people kind of psychologically is that the government was doing something that we thought they would never do. I mean, I remember our conversations, and Tom, if you could weigh in on this too, that there were days when I couldn't actually believe what was happening. We'd talk about, wow, they're never going to do that. They're not going to mandate a vaccine. And then they would do it, or they're not going to lock down schools again. And then they would do it. I mean, we were just pushed week after week after week to realize that the people we elect to represent us don't seem to always, for whatever reason, be acting in our best interest. I'm wondering, Tom, if that was your response to some of the stuff that was happening.
Yeah, it was. And I think for me, I could see the noose starting to tighten. But what, created a lot of anxiety for me was when, I believe it was Quebec, had some of their grocery stores that were refusing to allow unvaccinated Canadians into the stores to go get food. And I remember watching a video of two big burly security guards or police, but they were in sort of almost a paramilitary uniform, standing at the door of a grocery store. And they were refusing to allow unvaccinated people in to get the basic necessities of life, food. And I thought, okay, you're really, really close to the frog in the boiling pot stage. The frog is starting to realize that things are about to get really bad. And not long after was when the convoy actually started to become something up on social media. But I just want to say two things about the comments that we heard from the man and the woman. I listened to him and I felt this deep sense of pride in his voice and what he did. But when I listen to Jen, I hear this deep sense of remorse and sadness. And she was hard to listen to. Even myself, I lost my job because of actually my story is a little bit unique. I didn't get to the point where I was fired because I wouldn't take it. I lost my job because I was threatened that if I didn't take it, I was going to lose my job. And so I pushed back publicly. And I don't mean like it to the general public. I mean, internal to the college that I was teaching at. I hit sort of a reply all on the faculty and the staff that were copied on the email from the president saying, make no mistake, if you don't take this, you're going to be unemployed. And I pushed back really hard amongst that email distribution. And as a result of that, I was fired with cause, and I was lucky in the sense because I have an army pension. It's not huge. It's not bad, but I was a little bit less vulnerable than some of the other teachers.
Yeah.
But, tough to hear what people went through and what they lost.
And I think it only makes matters worse that they're now saying it didn't happen. I mean, how awful to victimize people and they say, I never did that. I mean, this is like an abusive spouse or something, isn't it, Jackie?
It is. I hate to be flippant about it, but I go back to the words that stick with me forever. The words of Bill Clinton when he was on trial for impeachment. It all depends on your definition of is. And I just replace is with all depends on your definition of forced.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that to me is what it was. And for them to sit back and the success of that. I will tell you, one of the things that really bothered me more than that was the fact that so many people complied. Yeah. I was stunned. It was like we had to go into small groups and speak secretively. And there were code words to find out if somebody might not be so willing. I would find in the halls where I was working, somebody would say something and I would go, oh, so they don't sound as compliant as I thought all the other people are. So it became like we became divided, partisan, and ultimately we're disillusioned.
Well, I know that you and I, in these phone calls that I've talked about the phone calls on the show and never identified who the person was, even though it was you, just because I was protecting your privacy, right? I didn't want you to be in trouble for being a non-believer. And in those days, people got in trouble for that sort of stuff. So your identity was secret, which is ridiculous.
Well, I had relatives who went to some of the rallies in Toronto at the time, and they said, I'm going to go to but if there's a camera around, I've got to hide because I don't want my boss to know that I'm at the rally. That's what some people were saying.
I mean, it's just,
but they went, but they were hiding their faces.
Well, I also think it's pretty clear from the way that supercut was put together and some of the comments that did these world leaders who mandated vaccines then get together and decide on what their talking points are going to be? Where is that? Like, they used to be called public servants, right? They used to be elected officials, unless I'm in La La Land historically, but seemed to actually care about the people they were governing. But now it's all about saving their own butts and never admitting a mistake and never saying we got it wrong. And what bothered me, I guess, the most about the mandates wasn't even the mandate. It was the fact that the shot itself had not been tested long enough. In the end, it didn't even prevent transmission, and that they wanted even healthy people with no risk of dying from COVID to take this experimental thing. It absolutely made no sense, and it still doesn't to this day. And I've never heard any of these leaders be called to account in an interview for that kind of thinking ever. I mean, hopefully one day they will, but I don't hear them answering any hard questions about it. It's shocking, actually.
I agree, because there's two things. There's truth, and then there was the narrative. And the narrative was trust the science. Well, that means just shut up and do whatever we say. That's what the narrative was. It was, this is what it is, and any dissent will be crushed. And that narrative, they are still continuing. They are not going to, it appears, based on what all these leaders are saying, they must have had a big secret meeting.
Yeah, big Zoom call. A big
Zoom secret talking points meeting, because they're all saying almost exactly the same
thing. I know, right?
So yeah, and they're not, and that's the narrative. Keep the lie going. Isn't that a rule for radicals by Saul Alinsky? One of the rules. I might be wrong, but that's what it is, and we can't keep going on like this.
Even look when they were using the slogans of "Build Back Better." They were deliberately exploiting the pandemic, and all of the world leaders were using the same exact language, build back better. I saw the video of Trudeau saying it, Biden saying it, the British guy saying it with the funny hair.
Boris Johnson.
Boris, yeah, sorry, the scarecrow, or Dumb and Dumber, take your pick. But, like all the world leaders were doing it. New Zealand was, Australia was, Build Back Better was the slogan. And, when you see them talk about the fact that the pandemic has created an opportunity to build back better. I'm sorry, but when you're ripping apart people's lives, you don't sort of brag about this wonderful opportunity that it's given you to reshape society in your godlike image.
Yeah, they seem to have dropped that, haven't they? I mean, I remember hearing this slogan being repeated over and over again, but I thought, what is going on? This is so weird. They're all saying the same thing. Where's it coming from? And now they don't say it at all. So something happened. A memo must have gone out.
Well, this is the new memo. I don't know what you're talking about. We never said that.
Yeah, it is absolutely true. They didn't hold anyone down in most places, but I would argue that I'd seen reports of them doing it in Australia or New Zealand, perhaps, where some of their Indigenous communities were being raided. And it was my understanding that they were going into certain places and holding people down and injecting them. If not doing that, they were sending people to jail in Australia.
Yes.
Spouses were having their husband or their wife committed and put into detention centers, because Australia was terrible for putting people into detention centers.
So even though the COVID thing is over, we are still living in the aftermath. And I think the aftermath is way more devastating because we're just sort of realizing what we let happen. And that's why I always come back to the truckers, because they were that moment when you went, oh, some people are not going to take it anymore. But now they're even suffering for it. So I think COVID is one of the worst. The COVID and the COVID mandates and the COVID everything is one of the worst things that's happened to Western civilization. I really do. And I don't think it will ever, we're in a new age now, and whatever we thought we were before, we're not going to be that anymore. And I don't know where it's going to end.
Well, it's historic and it's generational, and we're not going to stop talking about it on this podcast, even though I know a lot of people want to move on. And the forgiveness part, I've talked a lot about that. And there are days when I think I can get there, and there are days when I think I can't. And our prime minister gaslighting the country is one of the days that I think, no, I can't ever forgive that. Jackie, you mentioned the convoy, and we're going to switch gears a little bit and start talking about the trial with you and Tom. Before we do that, I'm just going to do a quick pitch, which is that everybody listening by now knows that we run the podcast based on your generosity and your support. And our funding platform is Substack, which seems a bit weird because it's a written platform, but it's a totally free speech. So I do write a Substack every week. You can comment on shows there as well. And if you want to support the podcast, that's where I would gratefully ask you to do it. I have a website, which is trishwoodpodcast.com. And I have a Twitter, which is @woodreporting, and an Instagram that I can never, ever remember my handle for, but it's Trishwood something. Yeah, that's me in technology. I'm faking it here, people. I had to learn all this stuff when I started the podcast, and I'm still not 100%. Any smart 16-year-old is better at it than I am. So we do appreciate your support. But Jackie is here in part because she and I have embarked on a documentary project called The Trials of Tamara Lich, which is not only about the trial that Tamara and Chris are facing now in Ottawa, which is where I am, but also metaphorically about the trials we are all kind of struggling through in this post-COVID era and what it means for protesting and how we view the government and how democracies are going to work or not going to work. And I just wanted to talk to her a little bit about that. And then we're going to go to Tom, because he's written a book about his experience with the convoy. So, Jackie, I'll just throw to you. And I don't need to ask you why you're working on the film, because we decided to do it together. So I know the answer. But what is your impression of what we're learning so far about these people who helped to bring this protest to Ottawa?
Well, I think they were courageous. Now, you may disagree with why they did it, and there are many Canadians who think they're evil, mean, and they're just the worst thing that ever happened. But their courage, to me, is what stands out. I will say, and I've thought about this for a long time, that what ignited me about the truckers and what I'm hearing, and I'm sort of still hearing it in the trial when you're listening to the evidence, I think the convoy is still the single most successful human rights grassroots protest in my generation, maybe even before, because of the fear of not doing anything and the fact that these people decided to do something. I find compelling. And the two people who became the face of the convoy, to me, stuck their necks out, as I say, and they did it. And they, considering that it was a disparate group coming from all over the country, I think they did it with great aplomb, and they did their best, because I think even they were amazed by how many people and how many truckers and protesters were with them. So that I found compelling, because you don't hear that a lot in Canada. A lot people tend to be very compliant, and Tamara Leach and Chris Barber, I thought very, very sanely, eloquently just did what they were doing, and they were always very pleasant. And even in the what's come out so far, and it's still early days, is Chris Barber to me sounds like a very, very nice guy. Like, he doesn't sound like some crazed maniac. In fact, I know he isn't, because I've talked to him. And neither does Tamara Leach. These people are measured people, and they're people I like. And I always say to myself when I'm interviewing people, would I want to have a glass of wine or a beer with this person? And because that always decides me what it means, do I want to spend time with them? And with these people, I found I did, and I liked them. And they're compelling. And the compelling part is they stuck their necks out where others wouldn't. And that I find is worth it. And they're willing to die on this. When she said to me, "This is my hill to die on," it was tough to listen to her. I was jealous of her, envious that she could say something like that. And she would say it so anyone could hear it. She was being recorded, and she said that. And I thought, wow, that's someone I admire. And that's one of the reasons why I think that part of the story has to be told. And you and I are going to tell that story.
Yeah. It was interesting sitting in court yesterday, too, because I wrote about this in my Substack. The Crown was playing all of these TikToks of Chris's for prosecutorial reasons. But what emerged from the TikToks is something that I believed as well, which is that he comes off as a decent human being. He's imploring the truckers to stay peaceful. He even quotes Gandhi at one point. He seems kind of hopeful and uplifted. There are times he's mad at the government's intransigence with them. But let's not forget, for all the people who say, well, they stayed too long, if Prime Minister Trudeau had shown the truckers the respect that he'd shown Black Lives Matter, he actually came out and took a knee to them, just by coming out and speaking to the various people in leadership roles at the convoy to figure out if there was a way out of the situation, the convoy would have ended. I've heard that from multiple people, that they were tired, it was cold, they wanted to go home. But because Trudeau was so dug in and wouldn't lower himself to speaking to people whom he had already demonized, that's why I said lower himself, then it ended the way it did. And it ended in a very, very dangerous way. And let me say, just for the record, what I say when I talk about the convoy now, the Public Order Emergencies Commission that looked into this, virtually all of the negative claims about the convoy were debunked there. Not very many Canadians know that, but they were. And so that makes it all the more egregious that nobody from the government would give these people the time of day. We heard one police officer say that to give them, they were instructed to not give the truckers an inch when they were negotiating with them on the streets. I mean, just this very kind of aggressive stance that almost ensured that it was going to end the way it did. And that's a shame, because a leader leads, and a leader leads for all Canadians. And this very much seems like, to me, a bit of a class struggle too. I think if these people had been wearing Lululemons and driving Teslas, they would not have been demonized the same way they were by our government, and to some degree by the people in Ottawa as well. That's a terrible. I know there are good people here. Don't mob me when I go outside the hotel, but there are good people here, and I've been talking to some of them as well. But it does really feel like a bit of a class struggle, and that's a shame, because is that where we are now again in Canada here? I mean, really, Tom, what are your thoughts?
Well, I take your point though about the perception of the the Lululemons and the Teslas, but from my point of view, my time on the ground during the convoy, we did have people with Lululemons who drove Teslas, because on the weekends, every weekend, the city swelled with supporters from Ottawa, the surrounding areas, and these weren't truckers. I mean, I'm not a trucker, and I met many non-truckers as well as other military veterans, active members of the military that, didn't want to be seen on camera or anything, but there was support across every single sector of our society. And I've seen, which is disappointing to me, but I know that, big corporate CEOs from, let's say, the Western provinces, huge supporters of the convoy, but we're not going to stick their necks out and publicly support the convoy at all. Like, that was just not going to happen, when they're more afraid of demonstrating moral courage than they are of losing share value. That's the situation you're in. So it looks like you get the perception that it was blue collar workers that were there. But the fact remains is that there was doctors there, lawyers there, dentists there, different types of medical professionals, and all manner of white collar people were there. And this is difficult because it's the perception that it was a blue collar thing, but it really was a Canadian thing. And all races, all religion, everybody that represented what Canada's melting pot is was there in Ottawa to support that convoy. I mean, there's 6 million Canadians that didn't get vaccinated. 6 million. So, I mean, that's a pretty darn good sample size, of who was actually there.
And what you just said is maybe the nub of why the era in which we live now is so frightening. And that is that people were afraid to declare their support publicly in some regions, and the snatching of bank accounts and then the publishing of the bank account holders is a very, very dark day. And I don't think it gets enough discussion. I mean, of course, amongst us, it does. But this requires its very own, I think, Royal Commission, because
absolutely.
Don't you think? Because it did intimidate people. And I will just say this, Jackie, and then I'll throw to you, but we're doing a Give, Send, Go for our film, which you can find on my website, which is trishwoodpodcast.com. If you want to support it, we'd be grateful. And we have heard pushback from a number of people who say, we want to support you, but we don't even believe in these funding platforms anymore, because if you give them money, you're exposed and you're doxxed, and they feel insecure about dealing with a platform, and they shouldn't feel that way. But that's what happened. You start messing with people's money and their anonymity, and you've created the perfect example of a draconian state. Jackie.
That is absolutely true. And I'm glad you brought that up, because the freezing of the bank accounts to me was actually the absolute tipping point for me. I donated to the truckers originally. And then when they shut that down and you had to go to Give, Send, Go, I remember it was a pittance compared to what if you were a millionaire, but it was a pittance what I gave. But there was my name on a list, because it became my bank account became accessible. And I thought, wow, has our country come to that? That to me it spoke about what these guys realized they could do with the power they had amassed. If they can control who sees your bank account and then control that, wow, we are in big trouble. And that's one of the stories that I think has to come out. And I get the impression that Canadians don't realize, or many don't realize how important that is. Because if you listen to international news, because I spend a lot of time in the U.S., some of my docs are playing in Britain, and I talk to people, and one of the things that a lot of journalists outside of Canada and just average people go, look what happened to Canada. Do we want our bank accounts? Do we want our government to look into our bank account and control it? And that's a scary thing that I think outside of Canada, people looked at.
Well, this is one of the reasons I feel sometimes that Canada let us down, because I have the same experience interviewing people from around the world on a variety of subjects, and they all say, did your government really freeze the bank accounts of trucker donators? Like, they can't believe it. And yet it's not front page news here. You know, people are not banging the drum for accountability about it. It's just like this new kind of Canadian obedience where we were once thought of being super kind and polite. And I wonder if that was just masking some kind of national fealty to obedience instead of critical thinking. Tom?
Well, I have a different take on the bank accounts being frozen or people not wanting to donate to Give, Send, Go or to these different causes. Because from my perspective, like, I had my bank accounts frozen. Yeah, I did. Yeah, I had mine frozen. And it put my son's life in a slight bit of a difficult position because, my son has had 2 open heart surgeries and I could not, it's my credit card that's on file with the pharmacy to buy his heart medication. So all of my financial assets were frozen. And, what happened was his mother luckily had the cash to purchase the medication. So that should be like front and center in everyone's mind. Like, cash could save your life, actually. But from my point of view, when I hear people say, I don't want to give because I don't want to get my accounts frozen, then I say to those people, then maybe you just don't deserve your freedom enough. You really don't. I mean, if you're going to cower to what the government has dictated and what they've done, then maybe you should really, really re-examine what the value of your freedom in this country is really worth to you. Because if you're not even going to take the simple step of help out somebody who wants to get the word out there because you're afraid, you let the government terrorize you, you let the government scare you into exercising your fundamental rights, then maybe you don't understand what it means to be a free person at all. And so I don't have a great deal of sympathy for people that say that kind of thing. It's like, if you don't even take the most slight stand, then are you really a free person, or are you just somebody who hopes to be a free person on the backs of the efforts of other people like Chris and Tamara?
Yeah, that's a good point. But let me just say this too, is that the people who said they don't want to give to the funding platform have said, where do I send a check? How can I give you money in other ways? So that, I think that, they're not wanting to support it. But it's interesting that the funding platforms are being used in this way against people too. And they shouldn't. I mean, I thought the Give, Send, Go, I even talked to them or was going to talk to them at one point during all of this. And they were very devoted to keeping it up and running and getting the money to the convoy. But I don't know what happened. I guess, people get scared, don't they? And we saw this in the UK recently with Nigel Farage's bank account being frozen, basically because he was a Brexiter. Yes. And right of center. I mean, they actually say that in the document. And I think you and Jackie and the other smart people I know will understand that once they start controlling our money, we're toast, right?
Yeah, well, they've in Canada, we've got somebody like Jeremy McKenzie, and I know of at least one other veteran who have been debanked here in Canada for their political views. Can't get bank accounts with any of the financial institutions in this country, and they're not. They just get the runaround. Jeremy McKenzie released a audio recording of his conversation with one of the banks he contacted, the bank that holds the mortgage on his house. And he's like, yeah, it's a corporate decision. The guy had no real answer to it, but unfortunately he's the guy who took Jeremy's call. But they don't have an answer. They're just said, the bank has decided for business reasons not to work with you. So we're seeing this, and there's another veteran because, I'm one of the co-founders, but I'm not the most active with a group called Veterans for Freedom. And we have another one of our veterans that have come forward recently and said, yeah, I've been debanked. So this is all still happening in the background. And, like Jackie was saying, when the bank accounts started to get frozen during the convoy, it didn't matter really, from my perspective, it didn't matter that veterans of all else were getting the crap beat out of them by police at the foot of the National War Memorial in our nation's capital. People didn't care about that. But my God, when their bank accounts suddenly became vulnerable, when they realized they had skin in the game, that's when ordinary Canadians, piped up and took notice. They didn't care about the beatings or the arrests or the protests or the mandates. They cared about their financial assets.
And I found what's interesting or compelling to me is that despite all the pushback that was getting, Justin Trudeau ignored and dismissed the concerns, not only of the truckers, but what he did then, he ignored the concerns of the rest of us. He dismissed us. Look, in politics, you can have a stance and you go out there and you say, we are against, you're a bunch of fringers or whatever you want to do. But behind the scenes, you can do some talking. None of that has happened. It is a complete shutdown. No discussion about this at all. And so it has to come through podcasts like Trish Wood is Critical, or the other citizen journalists that are doing this, because they have refused. And that is what is disillusioning. We voted these people in, we pay their salaries, and they will not even listen.
Yes. For 2 years, people protested across the world, and in Toronto, in Montreal, in Calgary, protests every weekend for 2 years. And what are the elected officials, the so-called representatives? They just close the curtain and they go about their day screwing over ordinary Canadians' lives with no perceivable consequence to their actions. So why should they respond to a fringe minority of 6 million people? Right. And that's what they did. And then the trucker convoy was like, you can't ignore us now. We're literally on your doorstep. You can't ignore us and we're not going away. It's like, oh, no, we'll see if I can ignore you, because Justin Trudeau did ignore us. And what did he do? He sent his police.
Well, and let's just be clear here about one thing. They were able to ignore people who were protesting initially because the media wasn't reporting it.
Yeah.
Right. Like, it was, well, there'd be these big demonstrations in the UK and London, various places, large crowds, and it was either not covered, or they diminished the number, or they would say, I just remembered this now, they would say, large numbers of anti-vaxxers are in the streets.
Yes.
Remember, there were all epithets. You couldn't be a protester in any of the COVID layers of nonsense without being an anti-vaxxer, whatever that means anyway, right? So the media, right from the get-go, was signaling to the governments doing this that they weren't going to hold them accountable. And I think once they got that message, then they were away to the races, so to speak, and the rest of it all kind of fell into place. But why would they, even in some of the worst diplomatic crises that have happened historically ever in the world, kind of geopolitically, even when people are hating each other, say Russia and America, or, there's some danger of nuclear exchanges, there are always backdoor discussions, maybe not at the highest level, but they send an emissary to sit down with the other person's emissary, and they talk and they go back and they say, well, there's room here, we can do this, maybe we can try that. That didn't happen with the truckers either. And that was a huge, huge failure of this government. And people say I'm being political. I'm not political. I could vote Liberal if the Liberals were doing what I thought they should be doing. For me, it's not about politics. It's about good governance. I don't care who's doing it, as long as they're governing for the people and not for the global elites. And more, they're proving that that's what they're doing. And I think that Trudeau's inability to sit down or have someone sit down with the truckers is responsible for the trouble we're in now, the divided nation that we're in now. Sorry, Tom, go ahead.
The OPP Inspector Bowden, he testified at the Public Order Emergency Commission. He said he was actually quite surprised that the government did not have any interest whatsoever in engaging with us in any form of a dialogue. He said, because historically they had. And, you know, over the last couple of years with previous big level protests, you know, with Indigenous communities and stuff like that, the government was willing to engage in those protests. But he said they were surprised that they actually didn't this time around. And he was, you know, recommending.
Tom, why do you think they didn't? He was recommending it. But why do you think they didn't, Tom? I have my own theory, but what's yours?
Definitely hubris. Like you alluded to earlier, that, you know, he wasn't going to come down to that level. You know, this is a guy, the emperor has no clothes kind of thing comes to mind. And this guy just was not going to come down to the people's level and get dirty. That's one thing. My other feeling is that he really, really desperately wanted his January 6th. And we saw testimony of that during the commission as well, when there was, the convoy was actually on the way. You know, the police were tracking the convoy across different convoys across the country. But when they got into Ontario, you know, I saw the text messages during the commission where the PMO staff was saying, hey, don't put too much pressure on them now. We don't want to push out the crazies. You know, so they wanted to make sure they had certain characters that were coming there. They wanted their January 6th. That I'm absolutely convinced of.
Yeah, no kidding. Jackie?
Yes.
What have you pondered why you think that the Prime Minister did not extend some kind of an olive branch? It would have brought the country together. It would have ended it in a way that wasn't dehumanizing to all the people who supported it. I mean, people who supported it after the bank accounts and this very heavy police action were actually frightened. That is not the way a democratic leader should govern, is it?
It isn't. And that, to me, is one of the most disappointing things about Justin Trudeau and Liberals. They've become illiberal. They don't operate anymore by liberal views, which used to be like anti-war, freedom of speech and stuff like that. I think Trudeau he became so separated from the people that we realized he didn't have to. I think that's it. We become two groups now. And there used to be people in the middle where you're either far right or you're this woke gang. And the people in the middle, which is a lot of people, he hasn't recognized them. And I am flummoxed why the guy hasn't listened to some of his other liberal, his MPs who've said, hey, you know, maybe we should sort of listen. We do some stuff behind the scenes. I don't know why. I think he is elite. I think he just doesn't get it. And I don't think he wants to. And I don't think he really cares, because if he did care, he would do it. But that's all I can say. I don't understand why this guy refuses.
He set up the idea that he couldn't speak to them with his very first comments, didn't he? Once he tried to convince the country that the truckers were Nazis and all of these other terrible things he said about them, He couldn't go out and negotiate with them, could he? Because they stopped being average Canadians and became these kind of caricatures of bad people. That's that he couldn't go out and negotiate with. So he painted himself into a corner with his ill thought through and, in my view, dishonest rhetoric.
No, I think he did. And I'll let Tom talk, because I think he's painted himself into a corner now. And it's kind of obvious.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this is an interesting thing, because he's done it again. If you see next week, I think on the 20th is the Million Man March for Kids. And that is predominantly like being that the genesis of that involved the Muslim community. So now we have a situation for this guy where if he comes out and says anything against the Muslim community, he risks being actually exposed as a Islamophobe, right? In favor of being a transphobe. So this guy, the catchphrase is that he likes to label people with across this country, and his government has been so masterful at creating this, is now going to come around and backfire on him.
Well, this is why the rhetoric is so dangerous, because Canadians don't want to be divided up that way. And when I saw that it was Muslim families protesting against some of the nonsense going on in classrooms around the country, I thought, well, wow, this is interesting.
Yes.
His head's going to explode because he's caught in the middle of an intersectionality trap. How does he get out of it? So I loved that. I thought it was a kind of a wonderful moment, because he's going to have to navigate it politically somehow, isn't he?
He gets out of it by resigning. So we'll take that as a win.
Yeah.
But when you have a policy where differences are better than what we have collectively together, we have a country that's based on, Canada is based on good governance. That's what Canada is based on. And we don't have that now. And they're push partisan and hostility and differences are better. These groups, and if you're not part of that group, which group are you in? Oh yeah, you're the lepers. You're the ones that must be are not in the good group. That's not good for a country, because I have loads of colleagues and friends that have completely different political views than me. And it doesn't matter, because I can still go out and have a beer with them and drink, and we laugh about stuff, and we'll even argue about stuff. But I like them. They're talented. I work with them. So it doesn't matter. There used to be a time when you never even asked a person their political views. You just sort of, you went to the polls, put your tick mark, and away you went. I like that. That's the kind of world I want to live in, where you're allowed to have different views and still mingle with each other.
Yeah. I would, here's the funny thing is, if you were to say to me 3 years ago, okay, where's your political leaning? I would say I was pretty centrist, very centrist. But if you really absolutely forced me to choose, I probably would have come down on the Liberal side. But, 3 years into this, I would say I'm much more conservative leaning, but I'm in a situation right now where I don't trust the Conservative Party whatsoever. I just don't trust them. I view them as being the other side of the same exact coin. Some of the things that Pierre Poilievre has done, I agree with, I like, but some of the things he's done are just absolutely shocking to me. And, I'm at a point where I feel more politically homeless than I ever have in my entire life. But yet, the argument comes down to, we'd have to do whatever it takes to get rid of the Liberals. And I'm not 100% sure about that. I'm still very, very conflicted on that idea. But what I would like to see is conservative-minded people and even liberal-minded people relearn the skills of respectful discourse when it comes to political debate. It doesn't have to descend into hateful speaking to each other. It could just be stick to the facts, try to solve a problem. Not win the argument, try to come to a resolution in a discussion about politics. But we can't even do that. And if you look at conservative-minded Canadians, if you look at the fighting between PPC supporters and conservative supporters, it's just as vicious as between conservatives and liberals. So we're so divided in such a vitriol, hateful way, even on the right-leaning spectrum or the left spectrum. It's just terrible. We can't seem to get our crap together and have very respectful discourse with one another over politics. And it should be the most important daily conversations that people are having. And yet we just can't do it.
Well, I think there's two reasons why. One of them is that never before, at least in my lifetime, have I seen personal demonization against someone of another political stripe as we see now, right? So it's not just that people who aren't liberal have different ideas about monetary policy and fiscal policy and social policy. They're terrible people. They're homophobic. They're transphobic. They're far right. They're racist, right? Once that started, and I blame Hillary Clinton. I say that on the show about once a month. I blame Hillary Clinton for everything. But once she dropped that against Trump supporters, remember that very famous speech. And that the media even let that stand. Like, she's demonizing a whole swath of the American body politic with stuff she has no clue if it's true or not. And that's what's happened now. So once someone's political stripe is defined by some kind of attending moral turpitude that is flung by the political opponent, then of course you can't have a dialogue, because it's not just that you're conservative, you're a bad person. Right.
Yes.
You're right. So and that is reinforced by our absolutely siloed legacy versus indie media. And I said this in the hallway outside the courtroom 5 in Ottawa. And that is that as long as people are getting their information from separate places, we live then in two different realities. There's a woman there. I've been speaking quite a lot to her. She's a lovely lady. Ottawa resident, doesn't like the convoy, has all sorts of ideas about what they were really up to, none of which are backed up by any facts as far as I can tell. But she believes those things are true. And so she holds enmity for the convoy because she believes those things are true. So until we are all back to agreeing on certain objective facts about the world we live in and who we are and what we're doing and what's good and what's bad, we will never be able to have undramatic conversations with people of a different political stripe about anything that has substance, right? Because you're a bad person. You're just a bad person.
I think you agree on that, because that's why I go back to what I said earlier. There used to be a time when there was truth, and people would truth was, you came to truth by discussion of a whole bunch of stuff, and you kind of came to an acceptance. But there is now truth and this narrative, which is being the Canadian media, which is largely controlled by the government, they support this narrative, and that means you cannot disobey that narrative. And until we can stop that, this will continue. Because there is no trust the science meant shut up and just do what we say.
Yeah, I've referred to it as cancel conversation. The moment the media is masterful at this as well. The moment they start to describe somebody, they add the pronoun far right or far left, but it's typically far right. The moment you start off describing the next person or organization you're going to talk about with the phrase far right, you've already been biased. You've already been vilified with those two simple words. Now look at, as an example, James Topp, who is a man that I've known since 1996. He literally walked from the Terry Fox statue in Vancouver, I believe it is, 4,300 kilometers to Ottawa, 131 days. And every chance the media had, they referred to him as a far right, whatever. No, James Topp is a Canadian. He's a 5-time deployed combat veteran. And he has been in civil wars. He's been in combat. He was in Afghanistan twice. He was in the Medak Pocket in 1993-94. This guy has been around the world serving his country for, 27-year career. And yet he's not described as a Canadian patriot who has literally put his life on the line for 2.5 years in combat zones. He's not described that way. He's described as far right. And that's meant to vilify an absolutely outstanding Canadian citizen who has exemplified sacrifice in dedication to his country. And the media can't even give him that simple courtesy of refer to him as a veteran. But they don't. And, James and I met with Paul Alexander with the Conservative Party last year, and I'm embarrassed by their conduct. But the Liberals were invited, the NDP were invited, the Bloc were invited. None of them showed up. and a small portion of the Conservatives actually showed up because James wasn't worth their time. And they had this, I'll fit him in if I can. I'm sorry, but I think that you should be tripping over yourselves to get into the room with a man who has given so much to this country. But they don't. And all 338 of them, the amount of arrogance that they display in their jobs on a daily basis is just shameful. Shameful.
Breathtaking.
It is.
And that actually makes me quite sad listening to that, because it shows how self-serving people in public office are today. There just aren't any bright lights out there that you can say, wow, I really want to give this guy my vote. I really can trust him, and he's a human being, and he sees beyond the nonsense. I don't see anybody out there who's like that right now. And that's quite depressing. So let's just wrap up here, you guys. First of all, I want to have Tom say the name of your book and where people can get it.
Yeah, the book is called The People's Emergency Act, the Convoy 2022. And it's available now in hardcover on Amazon. And we expect that in the day or two. We had a lot of challenges getting the book finally published, but around 4:00 yesterday afternoon, it finally showed up on Amazon. We expect the paperback will be up there, we hope, today too. But it's strange the way it worked out with Amazon. But the hardcover is available right now on Amazon, and it's called The People's Emergency Act, Convoy 2022, up on Amazon.
Okay, great. So people should check that out. Now, what I want to do now with both of you is just give people a bit of a flavor of what the convoy trial in Ottawa is like. I've experienced it one way. I've been in the courtroom every day. Jackie was in the courtroom a little bit outside with the throngs for some time. And Tom, you were kind of in and out. So maybe Jackie, start with you. What was I know we started our first conversation with you out front with Tinfoil Hat Man, who was kind of standing on guard for everybody at the courthouse. Tell me about him.
Oh, Tinfoil Hat Man was so interesting because outside that courtroom, very, very hot, everybody's really, really sweating. There was two groups. There was the media, which was all together. And because we're doing a documentary, we weren't part of that. We were back from everything. So we were covering everything. So there was the media on one side, and then over another little group of people who were there to support Tamara Leach and Chris Barber. And that gang, one of them was Tinfoil Hat Man, because I saw him. He was sitting beside me, and I said, "Can I ask you what that hat's about?" And it was kind of like he jumped up and he sort of made sure that it looked good. He says, "I have had this tinfoil hat on since the day the truckers were told to leave. And I am going to stand outside and he has a Canadian flag, which is about 15 feet high on a pole that he stands with outside. And he says, I wear this hat because I am going to stand outside this until this trial is over to remind Canadians of what we really are, that this is wrong." And look, here's the way these people are your average people. These are the kind of people who, I don't know what these people did for a living. They might have been Amazon delivery truck drivers delivering your parcel, whatever they were, but they were the real working class people, the average person. And he was, people looked, of course, you look at him with this tinfoil hat on and you kind of go, is this guy a kook? But when you talk to him, you realize he had very good reason, but he was energized he was going to make a point. And there were other people like that around, but the media, the legacy media, which was on one side, never, ever went and talked to these people. They ignored them, completely ignored, which I found astounding. And that's why I started talking to them individually and was very surprised at how lucid they were, because everybody's been pointing these people as some sort of kooks. They weren't at all. They were incensed, and they were angry. And you do see how there are two different solitudes in this country now. In that courtroom outside, there was two silos: the legacy media and the people who were there to support. There were a couple of people there who were there to not support Tamara Lich, and they were as vociferous as the people who were there to support the truckers' trial. So it was a very interesting experience because you most Canadians don't get to see that. When you get to feel it, and you kind of go, yeah, you know what? We are really divided. I don't know how we're going to get back, but I'm still hopeful.
Yeah. Well, and this city is such a bubble too.
Let me just say, I felt like a stranger in a strange land. That's what I will say. So
me too. Watching my P's and Q's around here because I feel like I'm a bit of an alien being. Tom.
Yeah, that man was, he was right out front of the Public Order Emergency Commission every single day for 7.5 weeks too. And I spoke to him, and, when I would speak to him in the morning when I'd walk in, say hi, see how he was doing. And he was there every day. And when I saw him on Tuesday at the first day of Chris and Tamara's trial, I saw him there. I was happy to see him. I walked up and, thanked him again and had a few words with him and just to see how he's doing. And I was really encouraged that he was standing there. He's not hurting anyone, but he's there to make his point. And he's not going to be ignored, but other than by the legacy media, which is no surprise there. But, from... a lot of people did ask me, well, why are you going? Like, why are you going to Chris and Tamara's trial? And I said, because, they're about to get their lives ripped apart in this ridiculous trial. And they're my friends. And when they're going to be having their lives put under the microscope, I want to make sure that I'm standing right there beside them when it's happening. And unfortunately, I couldn't stay for the whole thing. So what I'd like to be able to do is to go back and forth because I'm in the GTA, and I want to go back as often as I can. But man, try to get a hotel room in Ottawa and afford it. Like, it's ridiculous. Yeah, and so financially it's difficult. I haven't had a job in 2 years. I got fired from my job 2 years ago, not for a lack of trying to find one, but, I've had to change my name to James Marazzo on my resume, just to, I'm a 50-year-old, relatively new software developer. I only graduated 4 years ago, but I worked as a teacher, and now my name is somewhat, toxic to certain employers. So, this
is not good. This is not, I don't like this at all.
I know.
Tell me about what it was like for you seeing when you were here, the reality of Tamara and Chris being actually on trial in a criminal trial in a building with a justice. And what was your reaction to that when you were actually here experiencing it?
Well, to be honest, when you watch Tamara, when she walks in, and you see this level of confidence, I compare it in my mind. I compare it to somebody who is in the UFC and they're walking into the ring, and they believe in their soul that they're going to win. And so when you take one look at Tamara, she just exudes confidence. And same with Chris, but Chris is like you say, he's an amazing, wonderful human being. He makes you feel like you're hanging out. Like the first time I met him, I'm like, wow, did you and I go to high school together? Like, have we known each other for 35 years? What's the deal here? Like, he's just such a welcoming person. Like, he's big. He's a big boy. He's 6'4", 260 pounds. But he doesn't make you feel like he's overbearing in any way. He's such an absolutely warm and wonderful, inviting person. And, so when you see them sitting in that courtroom, Chris is a little bit more apprehensive. Tamara, she's like, bring it on. So that gives me confidence. But watching this, my biggest interest was personally in the judge. And I wanted to get a good solid sense of the character of the judge, because this is not a jury trial. It's from the judge will be making the final decision. I'm encouraged But I was also, for the first 3 weeks of the commission, I was encouraged by Injustice Rouleau, only to find out later what a letdown that was. So I don't want to get ahead of myself. I don't want to have a false sense of security in this current judge with Chris and Tamara's trial. But I think you've got people that are vigorously ready to defend themselves. But I also get the impression in the first day of the trial that I saw, and what I've been reading on your stuff and some others about the trial, I believe that the judge right now is trying to manage her courtroom and to focus on the right things. And she, a month before the trial started, she says, look, this isn't a trial. The convoy's not on trial. It's Chris and Tamara that are on trial, and she's going to be watching to make sure that the convoy is not on trial and that Chris and Tamara are not going to be persecuted for the perceived misdeeds of the convoy. It's about Chris and Tamara. And as long as this judge focuses on that, my impression was that she was focused on that on the first day. And I hope that that's going to be the case going forward.
Yeah, I like her. But, who knows?
Yeah.
She seems, as you say, she's running the courtroom very well. Yesterday, she even asked the gallery if we were able to see the screens that the two talks. So I mean, I think she's very aware of the historic moment that she is presiding over. I think she's bending over backwards to be fair.
Yes.
The fact that she seems likable, I guess, is, I suppose, neither here nor there, but it's kind of a bonus, I think.
Well, I had seen an article about her a few years ago where, she, in some of her rulings in Ontario were being called into question by the Ontario Crown Attorney. They wanted to, I think, appeal some of her decisions because, she was dealing with a shoplifter. And there was kind of like a mandatory minimum type of sentencing and fines and stuff. And this homeless person who was caught shoplifting, there's no way they could have afforded the fines. And so her ruling was more based on, yeah, I've got this law that I have to abide by, but let's find some wiggle room in here to be compassionate. And so this was something, going back to, I think, 2014 with this judge that we found. And so I think there's an element of public compassion historically from this judge. But I got to say, the entire judiciary in this country has been a colossal disappointment. In the last 3.5 years, I've been absolutely just gobsmacked at the decisions in these injustices where people were taking judicial notice and outright refusing to look at evidence. And so that always concerns me because we have a separation of powers in this country. We're supposed to. We are supposed to have a separation of powers, and that is intended to protect the public from the government. And yet, when a judge takes judicial notice in favor of the so-called experts, and then when the experts are put under cross-examination by lawyers, they can't even produce the evidence. So, when you're seeing judges saying, I'm going to rely on the expert opinion of somebody, and then you find out there was no actual evidence, that is alarming. And you don't see any of the judges walking it back. You don't see any retrials or mistrials. Like, what's going on in this country with the judiciary? And then to top it all off, I mean, this Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Wagner, he's a progressive, liberal who has made public statements that are shocking regarding the convoy. And so he has now disqualified himself to ever see any matter brought before the Supreme Court of Canada because of the public statements he was giving about the convoy during the convoy. These people put themselves into some really bad positions as a judiciary.
I remember that. Yeah, I do. So I guess what you're saying is you never know. I mean, anybody who's covered criminal trials knows that. I mean, look at OJ.
Yeah.
Anything can happen. I mean, the guy clearly guilty, but anybody who followed the case, and then some of the historical things done about it, including OJ Made in America, one of the jurors admits that she let OJ off because Rodney King's attackers in the beating video got off, the police. So, you never know what's going to happen in a court of law. And,
Well, yeah, I mean that the Americans were terrified of a huge race war, in civil unrest, like something they'd never seen, and that's why he got off. And I don't want to say this to commit a crime or anything, but I would think that right now with this trial, that would be a consideration in the mind of any judge. Something like that, what would be the consequence to the public if the public does not perceive this to be getting a fair trial or justice? I think that everybody in the back of their mind is thinking, if these two get convicted or see any jail time, what is the consequence going to be?
Well, I think the worst consequence is going to be just that people feel that they can't protest if they aren't protesting a liberal cause. That seems to be what we're kind of seeing around the world. Jackie, what was your sense, just give me a wrap up here, of seeing these two on trial in Ottawa?
Well, to me, the trials of Tamara Leach are the trials about us as Canada. That's what I think this really is about. Whatever happens, whatever the decision, it will define Canada moving forward. Because Tamara Leach is unlike the compliant Canadians. She's not linguini spined. She walked in there and you knew she was confident. She felt whatever happens, she was there because she believed in what she did. She was very, very confident about that. And even though it's not about the convoy, no, it isn't about the convoy. It's about Canada and the way our ability to have democracy and protest and discord the way we had before. That's what I think this is about. The trials of Tamara Leach are the trials about the rest of us in Canada. That's what I think it is. And I think it's worrisome.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you both. Tom, say the name of the book again and where you can get it.
Yeah, it's called The People's Emergency Act, Freedom Convoy 2022. And it's available on Amazon right now in hard cover, and soon it will be in paperback as well.
Well, great, guys. Thanks very much. I'll be seeing Jackie, you soon, I hope. I'm hopping the train back today. And thanks so much for doing this. I'm really grateful.
Thank you.
You can count on me.
Thanks, Jax.
Okay.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
That was Jacqueline Bynon, who is working with me on a film about Tamara Leach, and Tom Marazzo, who has a book out about his time with the Freedom Convoy. And I'm just going to say this. I'm sorry if I sound distracted and tired, but I am both of those things. It's been a long week here. As I said at the beginning, covering trials is hard work. And we've got a film going as well, and I have other projects. So it's been a busy week, but I would not have missed this for the world. It's so important that people pay attention to what's happening in Courtroom 5 in the Ottawa court building here. So I'm going home, but I'm coming back. I want to bring your attention to a book I'm associated with. It's called Canary in a COVID World: How Propaganda and Censorship Changed Our World. And that's just come out. And there's a lot of really interesting people who have chapters in this book. I am included in it. I don't think I'm all that interesting, but I do have a chapter. Jay Bhattacharya, Rodney Palmer, Paul Merrick, Edward Dowd, Jessica Rose, Joseph Freeman. Most of these people have been on the show. Peter McCullough, Norman Fenton, Steve Kirsch, Naomi Wolf, Bruce Pardy, Colin McAdam, who actually lives near Ottawa. He's one of Canada's top fiction writers. Brianne Dressen, George Fareed, Christopher Chope, Pierre Corey. So a lot of really interesting people writing about censorship and COVID, and it's worth taking a look at. You can get it on Amazon as well. The other thing I just wanted to remind you about is that the Free Speech and Medicine Conference is coming up again in Bedeque, Nova Scotia. Go to their website, and you can buy tickets there if you can manage it. It's really worth going to. They've got amazing guests this year, including Ian McGilchrist, who is a huge star in the neuroscience world, and my old friend Rupa, and lots of other really cool people. So it's an intense couple of days to sit with, have dinner with, and listen to some very important people talking about issues that I know you care about. And then finally, my pitch, we have a Give, Send, Go on my website, trishwoodpodcast.com. If you want to contribute to the making of this film, we would be grateful. And in the meantime, I would just say to you, stay tuned on my Substack and Twitter. I'm live tweeting some stuff from the trial and doing wrap-ups every day. And I will be going home tonight, but coming back next week. So in the meantime, stay critical.